So it's time for me to do this. I've been putting these off for some time, but just recently there's been a lot of chatter and discussion about these wagon kits in one of the Facebook groups I'm in. So I thought, now's the time to put my 10 pennants within. The kits themselves have been around since 1960, when Airfix first produced them. In 1984, the railway side of Airfix was sold to Dapol, and between them, they must have produced hundreds of thousands of these wagon kits. When the kit was first produced, they would have been cutting-edge stuff, as only 3 years before, in 1957, Charles Roberts' wagon works at Horbury produced them in real life. So given that these kits are now 60 plus years old, do they still have a place in modern day modelling? If I could stop waffling and start building, we'll find out. As you saw a moment or two ago, I've got 6 of these in my kit stash, and I'm going to build all of them. And this is going to feed into several of my little traits. Emptying all of the packets onto the workbench, and then removing all of the pieces from the sprues into 4 separate tubs. Underframe, tank barrel, couplings, wheels, and also another little plastic bag for all the parts that I'm not going to use. And that'll be the older style hook couplings, the ladders, and the plastic wheels, because Dapol now include metal wheels in the kit itself. And I won't be using the supplied ladders or walkways because I got some etched ones from RT Models. Again, link in the description below. Oh, and I almost forgot some replacement buffers as well from Lanarkshire Models. I mentioned a minute ago about the metal wheels supplied in the kit. Unfortunately, they don't do anything about the receptacle that it goes into, so we're going to have to deal with that. For this part, and for a few other bits and pieces on this kit, it's probably a good idea if you have a good supply of twist drills to hand. As with most of my other kit build videos, brass bearing cups is the way to go. The difference with this kit is, though, it's not designed to take brass bearing cups, so we're going to have to drill the axle boxes out to take whichever one of those that you decide to use. And then it's a bit of guesswork to how deep to drill. So long as you don't drill through to the other side, it should be fine, because you can pack it out if you've gone a little bit too deep. Because I was using the top hat variety of bearing cup, I had to then drill out a little bit more with a large diameter drill to accommodate the flange on the bearing cup. How do we know when we've got it right? Well, when we insert the wheels, we get both sides, the sole bars and the W irons, parallel to each other and at 90 degrees to the base chassis. And also the wheels turning freely at this point as well. This is probably the most critical part, because if the wheels don't turn, it's no point in carrying on. Because of the flimsy-ish nature of the chassis at this stage, I wasn't that concerned that all 4 wheels were touching a flat surface. They can be manipulated later on when we put the tank on. A combination of the fact of these kits being so old, and they now use recycled plastic as well, sometimes we get an awful lot of flash. It's a little bit annoying, but only takes a couple of minutes to get rid of. Like the TPO video I did just before Christmas, this one is going to be done in the same vein. That means I'm not going to super detail this. I'm just going to make it less detail deficient. We'll start that process with a piece of styrene rod to represent the discharge pipe. No, that's not a euphemism. Along with the additional parts, we're also going to make sure that all of the kit parts fit together properly. Most of them do, but a few of them need a little bit of a helping hand with a file. I'd already decided that I was going to use aftermarket buffers for this kit, and knowing where to get the right ones helped immensely. The kit parts being covered in flash wasn't the main reason for that. It was because these buffers were the price of an expensive cup of coffee. Very reasonable in my eyes. It does also mean that we're going to have to make more use of our drill set. The only thing to be wary about is making sure that they sit flat on the headstocks, no gaps. I mentioned a bit ago that I'm not going to use the original couplings in this kit for the obvious reason that they're not compatible with anything else that I have, and because there's a more modern coupling in the packaging with an adapter plate. I'll be using the adapter plate but not the coupling. I think it's just a little bit too chunky, and I prefer the Hornby one that fits onto this adapter plate, albeit with a little bit of manipulation, because it's a little less obvious. And what do I mean by manipulation? Well, I had to cut the wings off, so to speak. Hopefully you can see that on this one that I've done. If the camera will focus, there you go. It does also look as if it's not quite far forward enough, but I can assure you that it is, and when coupled to this and other wagons, happily goes round second radius curves. The major parts now on, we'll turn our attention to the delicate bits. Firstly, the brake blocks. And although this looks dangerous, it really isn't. There's no way that you'll drill through your own finger. I mean, I've only used 14 packets of plasters on this whole project. Although the brake blocks are handed, it is quite difficult to get them in the wrong position. A little bit of liquid poly cements them in place, and another piece of styrene rod represents the brake linkage. Again, I'm not going super detail, only want to make a reasonable representation. The inside set of brake blocks were really easy. The outside, a little bit more involved, because the coupling adapter plate doesn't get in the way, but it needs to be fully assembled before you put the linkage on. For a kit of this age, it's also quite nice to see that the brake blocks actually do sit in line with the wheels, something that some modern representations don't do. I'm thinking that both Hornby and Dapol use a generic chassis under quite a lot of their wagons that don't have the brake blocks in line with their wheels. More drilling, and this is for the brake linkage that joins one of the handbrake levers and the vacuum cylinders. It would have been a whole lot easier to do this before I started assembling, but I didn't know I needed to do it before I started assembling. With these tiny little pieces that I've scratch built, I sometimes wonder or question myself whether I'm doing the right thing. They could have been done a lot simpler, but they wouldn't have looked as good. When I said I wasn't going to do super detail, but I've ended up doing stuff like this, I know the things that run through my head when I'm doing it is I can do it, so I will do it. But does that detract from the original brief that I gave myself? I'll ponder that while I'm doing the next project. On a more positive note, I'm really pleased the way these chassis have turned out, which means that we can turn our attention to the barrels. And because I've opted for aftermarket parts, it means that I'm going to have to do quite a lot of filling. Using styrene rod and strip instead of filler or putty. Because the plastic is a little bit soft and my liquid poly is a little bit aggressive, it means that we can force the plastic rod into the holes and the liquid poly will melt the two pieces of plastic together. And you can see, if I can find a nice close-up view, you can see all the oozing out that it does, filling all the gaps. Then I snipped off most of the excess and filed a lot of it, and then with some sanding sponges took it down to where I thought it was necessary before painting. Because I'm doing 6 of these things, I hope you don't think they're all going to be the same. That would be very uncharacteristic of me. One of them I'm going to do that still has the bolts that hold the oval nameplate in place, like this one here. We'll do that by roughly marking out where the holes should be, drilling through, then filling the big holes that hold the nameplate in place, superglue some brass studs in, file them flat or virtually flat so they're just protruding, and then give myself a nice pat on the back for only deciding to do one like this, because that was a right pain in the arse. It seems like it's taken ages to get this far, gluing the two halves of the barrel together, and there's a long way to go before we even think about painting. Thinking too far ahead, because there's a lot more filing, sanding, and now we've got to install a nice weight so that and a nice little contraption to stop the weight bouncing about. Once that's been glued in place, we can put the ends on, making 100% sure that we get the right end on the right end. That sounds really odd to say, but it means so much. The weight going into the barrel and being secured firmly, and the last few detail pieces going on, and preparing now for the aftermarket etches. The first couple of pieces of which were really easy to fit. The walkways, on the other hand, did give me a bit of a headache, and I did the first one according to the instructions, didn't like it, so did it my own way. And that was to draw some parallel lines on the top of the barrel, the correct distance apart for the walkways, then tape the walkways to the workbench, glue the supports on, and then snip off the bits that were supposed to go in the holes and glue them straight onto the barrel. It was a lot easier. It was for me anyway. I thought that cleaning up a little bit of super glue was a lot easier than filling some holes. I had to fill some holes, but not on the barrels, on the chassis, because I'd got this far knowing what I was going to do, and then other things became apparent to me. And that's because of my acquired rivet counter status. Bearing that in mind, what do you think I know about these wagons? Not a lot. Thumbing through the books, we've already previously discovered the first batch was built in 1957, and then other subsequent batches produced over 1,000 of these wagons, or this type. Class B, initially numbered 33XX. The addition of tops made them 433XX. They reigned supreme for about 10 years to the mid-60s, until larger, higher capacity wagons with better suspension and air brakes ousted them from their primary roles. The mid-70s saw 150 converted into mineral wagons, MTVs. A whole load more were converted and sent to Ireland. Accurascale and Helgen are producing these. So we've discovered that most of them went out of regular service in the mid to late 60s, early 70s. Why am I building them? Well, Facebook gave me the answer when I stumbled across a couple of pictures that saw them being repurposed for molasses transportation. Those that weren't repurposed or scrapped found their way into departmental service, and that's how my 6 are going to end up being finished. Some are going to be repurposed wagons, others are going to be departmental. So to kick off the paintwork, after they've had a little bit of a soak and clean up in a hot water bath, going to give everything a coat of not black. Before assembling the tank barrels, I gave them all a coat of the colour that I'd allocated their desired traffics. 4 of them in blue and the other 2 in flat black. Now, because my membership of the Rivet Counting Association is only temporary, I'm going to use it as a shield as opposed to a badge of honour now, because I know that there's different batches of these wagons and they all have specific detail differences. I don't have the book that tells me that information, but what I do know from playing spot the difference on various different photographs is that the first batch had the ladders slightly to one side of the valve on the top. The later batches had it directly in line with the filler cap. I've done a couple of each, and it was another pain in the bum. As soon as it was done though, 2 coats of black paint and then on with the detail painting. There wasn't much, but there was enough to keep me entertained for a little while. Most of the transfers that were supplied with these kits went into my spares box. I think the only ones that I did use was a couple of fast traffic stars. For the molasses tanks, I had some custom made transfers from Railtech. Do your own research, fire off an email. A week later, he produces the goods. Sealed in with some clear varnish, we can now start having a little bit of fun. The transfers I did use off from the original pack. On one of the wagons, I then painted those numbers out with some gloss black. I've got dozens of screenshots from Paul Bartlett's excellent website, linked in the description below for reference, and you can see how the numbers have been painted out on this wagon. Then something really strange happened in the way of I found a wagon that I built many years ago and thought I can do something with that, repaired it, and then took inspiration from this wagon on Bartlett's site. I gave the wagon a bit of a paint job, put some transfers on, and then got a sanding stick out and filed them off. And I was really impressed how this happened. I could see them going, and then it was just a case of not going too far. And that wasn't too difficult. I can see it. It's about right now. There you go. Then I thought I could push my luck and have a go at the lettering on the other side. Because every wagon has 2 sides, I thought I'd push my luck even further and see what happens when I go a little bit too far and remove nearly all of the lettering. We'll get a better look at that in a moment, because I'm still working on the same wagon, and I'm going to use gloss black this time and put a huge daub around the filler cap, and then we're going to keep loading the brush with thinners until it's absolutely saturated, and then pull all of that down to the bottom. We won't really know how that's done until all of the thinners is evaporated away. We'll have a look in a minute. The one that I did with the bolts showing through got a daub of burnt umber oil paints on all of the bolt heads, and then with some thinners I dragged that all the way down to the bottom. Of the 7 wagons that I've ended up with, most of them got some individualised weathering, and then all of them got a really thin coat of brown. And when I say thin, I mean like 75% thinner to paint, and that was sprayed from directly above the wagon, so sort of 90 degrees from the very top. It was difficult enough to see that it was actually going on when I was spraying it. On the camera it doesn't show up at all, but if you look at my glove you can tell that something was definitely going on. For the molasses tanks, I created my own wash called treacle syrup. This was applied in the same way as we did the first wagon. A huge blob around the fill and hatch, and then loaded up with thinners and dragged it down the side. I didn't want to go too overboard with these ones because in the reference pictures they don't look to be that dirty. After this application had dried off, it did seem a little bit too much, so I went back in with some thinners and just feathered the edges out. A couple of them also got some weathering powders, but unlike mineral wagons where there's almost no limit to how much you can put on, with these a tiny little bit was almost too much. The last of the weathering was a really thin coat of rail match brake dust, again so thin you can hardly see that it's gone on. Because our buffers are hydraulic, that gives us the ability to paint the shanks silver. With some flat black, we're going to paint some grease spots on our buffers, and this will prove that there really was some discoloration when we did our really thin coats of weathering. So I've ended up with 7 of these things, and let's just have a quick look to see how they all turned out. Firstly, the one that I found in a box, and that's going to be my internal user wagon that will end up hiding round the back of the shed, being unloved and largely forgotten. A bit like a tender off of a steam engine being used as a sludge tank. The next one is, I don't know what to describe this one as really. I describe it as an ADB numbered one. It's a bit like the previous one, but was allowed to go on the main line. I've just noticed I've bent the ladder on this one, so I'll have to fix that before it goes back on the layout. The next one is in the same style as the previous two, and I'm going to use this as a lube oil wagon. I couldn't find the correct lettering, which is slightly annoying, but it won't bother me too much. I think these wagons ended up being owned by British Railways and used for lube oil traffic, themselves being superseded by other bigger air-braked wagons when they become surplus to requirements in the later 80s. Now for the molasses tank variation, all of which seem to be of the later design type, some of which had the reinforced securing pads, which I did put on. I'm not too sure about the traffic flows for these wagons. I know one of them was from King's Lynn Docks to Bristol. I'm not sure how they actually travelled across the country either, whether they were in a block train on them by themselves, or whether they were a portion of a larger mixed traffic freight train. I'm sure someone on here or in one of my Facebook groups will know. So as we get close to the end of another video, which has been an enjoyable voyage of discovery yet again, it leaves me with the task of answering the question I posed at the beginning. After 60 years plus of sterling service, do these kits still have a place in modern modelling? Yes, probably. But for the beginner modelers out there, hone your skills on box type wagons. They're a lot easier. These can be tricky and they're very easy to get wrong. For intermediate and advanced skilled modelers, I would say, yeah, go for it. You can put your own stamp on it like I've done. And I've only really scratched the surface of them. There's so much more you could probably do with these things. As it stands at this moment in time, I have nothing new on the modelling bench, so I'm unsure what the next one's going to be. Until then, thanks for watching. See you next time.